Anatomy, a love story by Dana Schwartz. Chapter by chapter book summary. Prologue, Edinburgh, 1817. Davy Jasper, a 12-year-old, and his partner Monroe are resurrection men who illegally obtain corpses to sell to doctors for their studies. The pair team up with a teenage girl, Jeanette. She attends the funerals to verify that the coffins are poorly sealed and therefore readily accessible for burglary. The story starts off with Davy and Monroe digging up the grave of a woman named Penelope Marianne Harkis. They try to leave the cemetery in a wheelbarrow with her body, but soon they were faced by other men. Monroe did get away, but Davy was taken. The men harm him and take a drop of his blood in a vial containing some kind of yellow liquid. Chapter 1, 1817. On an evening walk, 17-year-old Hazel Sinnett comes across a dead frog, which she carries back with her to the residence at Hawthornden Castle, where she resides with her mother, Lady Lavinia Sinnett, and her 7-year-old brother, Percy. The family's castle is located an hour south of Edinburgh. Hazel once had another brother who died from a fever many years earlier. Her mother, Lady Sinnett, has never overcome that sorrow. Meanwhile, Hazel's father is stationed in St. Helena as captain of the Royal Navy and governor of Napoleon's incarceration. At home, Hazel tends a fresh cut on the cook before retreating to her balcony to perform an experiment with the frog and a metal fire poker. Hazel is trying to tap into the electricity from the storm's approach to animate the dead frog's legs. She recalls what it was like when her cousin Bernard had seen this same sort of demonstration in Switzerland given using a human corpse by Galvani's son. Finally, after having been momentarily dragged off her task by Percy, she can complete her experiment with a metal key instead of the fire poker. Chapter 2. And now she went to the Armont house, where her uncle and aunt, Lord and Lady Armont, were staying. Lord Armont had been helping to look after Hazel in her father's absence. Upon arriving, she saw that there was a beggar and also a doctor with a black eye patch. The doctor, Dr. Edmund Strain, pulled out a tooth from the beggar and implanted it into Lord Armont's mouth because he had one missing, for which the doctor paid to the beggar the molar. Hazel is aware that it has always been assumed by everyone that she will someday marry Bernard, a childhood friend. She wants, however, to be a surgeon. She has read Dr. Beecham's treatise on anatomy the previous evening, and she is aware that Dr. Beecham is giving a free demonstration in anatomy the next morning in Edinburgh. Chapter 3. When Hazel catches up with Bernard, she invites him to join her for the anatomy demonstration the following day, and he would refuse to take her along if he were present. He declines this invitation, and they begin to argue. Hazel reminds him that he has always supported her dream of becoming a surgeon, but Bernard points out, it was because they were mere children. Besides, surgery is a field meant for men without money or status. After the falling out, Hazel goes for a walk and notices that, around Armont House's side gate, there is a red-headed woman with a maid's cap. She watched the maid pass a note to a boy whom Hazel christens Jack, who, in turn, gives the maid several coins in exchange. Chapter 4. As Hazel watches, the red-haired maid Jeanette is giving a tip to 17-year-old Jack Ellis Currer on where to find a good body for digging up and selling. Having also noticed Hazel herself, Jack notices her beauty and wealth. Chapter 5. The following morning, Hazel proceeds alone to the place of demonstration by Dr. Beecham as Bernard is unwilling to accompany her. During breakfast, Lady Sinnett talks about their journey to London which is going to happen for this season. She says that it is a relief since fever is spreading throughout Edinburgh. Hazel rides her horse into town to the Royal Edinburgh Anatomists' Society. In the crowd, she sees Dr. Strain from yesterday. She waits until everybody goes in and then she is going to go in. However, when she attempts opening the door, she realizes it's locked. At that moment, Jack, the boy from yesterday, approaches her. He offers to help her get inside, leading her through an alleyway and a dark passage to a door that opens to a space beneath the auditorium's risers. There, she can watch the demonstration clearly yet remain unseen. He leaves her there. Chapter 6. Meanwhile, Jack still could not fathom why he tried to save the life of this beautiful, wealthy girl. But he knew he had to help her. That same day, he sold one of the bodies he dug up at the graveyard to Dr. Strain, the buyer assigned by the Royal Edinburgh Anatomist Society. Now he went on to the Le Grand Lion Theatre, where Jack swept floors and general odd jobs to help out with constructing the stage sets. He wanted to invite one of its leading ladies, Isabella Turner, out for the night. Chapter 7. She watches, crouched underneath the rafters, as Dr. Beecham holds up a vial of milky blue fluid called Etherium, an anesthetic, he says, that takes all pain from surgery. And he uncovers another of his inventions, a gas lamp that lights up the hitherto darkened room. Lying on the table is a patient with a seriously swollen, bruised leg. Two gentlemen restrain the patient down as Dr. Beecham applies the potion to a handkerchief and presses it against the face of the patient, whereupon he stops squirming. Dr. Beecham proceeds with the removal of the affected leg as the fumes keep the patient unconscious. As he finishes the surgery, the audience erupts in applause, and the patient awakens drowsily. Before these can disperse, however, Dr. Beecham reminds them that his course of anatomy lectures is shortly to commence. Whereat Hazel, smitten with a quite delightful resolve not to go to London this season with her mother. And when, at last, she finds herself out of doors, Dr. Strain espies her, and remarks that she seems to be out unattended, and passes on. Chapter 8. The next morning, Hazel readies herself for an explosion of trouble since she'd been gone all day, but her mother doesn't even come out of her room. Days afterward, Lady Sinnett addresses the issue of going to the theatre with Hazel. She then proceeds to mention how everything in their estate belongs to Percy, placing the need upon Hazel for security regarding marriage to Bernard for her future. That evening at Le Grand Lion, Hazel was resplendent in a red gown. As they entered, they were greeted by Bernard and Lord Armont. In making her way to the seats, Hazel sees Bernard seated next to her uncle and Cecilia Hartwick-Ellis and her twin brother Gibbs. Hazel and her mother watch awkwardly as Bernard and Cecilia flirt with each other. Well, the play begins, and it's about a woman whose husband went off to war. The devil disguises himself as her husband, he seduces her, and when she realizes what happens, she kills herself. The husband comes back and finds her dead, hence the tragedy of the play. As Hazel watches, she considers how this plot is rather like other plays they've seen, with the same moral about women preserving their virtue. After the performance, Hazel's mother warns her about the cruel world to women. She says that in case Hazel marries, she would be at the mercy of her relatives. All the same, Lady Sinnett reminds Hazel that most men may not be as understanding about her interests, like reading as Bernard has been. Chapter 9. There are 2 stagehands absent tonight. Mr. Arthur says that he hears they have died from the fever. He looks backward now and can almost picture himself running from his drunken mother, years begging and doing card tricks on the street for cash. Then, Munro showed up and he got turned onto the world of resurrection men. Richer families used iron or concrete in coffins to ward off those who would steal bodies. Others hired someone to watch graves as many as 3 days following a funeral, until the remains were too stale for resale. Most bodies received none of this protection. When Jack took up his appointment at the theatre, he vowed that grave robbing would end there. The sight of the prosperous customers at the theatre, however, stirred in him a desire for a life worthy of the best, and he turned back to his old ways. It had a ballerina on it, he recalled, for which he had paid a month's wages, with the thing intended for Isabella. Tonight, he looks for her after the show but arrives at her dressing room just in time to see her kissing Thomas Potter, the lead actor, in the alleyway. Overcome by anger and humiliation, Jack drops the music box, chipping the ballerina inside, and leaves with the broken gift. Chapter 10. Word of a possibly imminent fever outbreak has Lady Sinnett determined to keep Percy safe, so they pack their bags post-haste bound for Bath en route to London. Meanwhile, Hazel feigns illness in the hope that her family will leave her home to indulge in her interests. When the others leave the house, only Cook and Iona, the maid, are left with her. She immediately drops her act and chats with Iona about the footman, Charles, having a crush on her. Hazel donned George's old clothes, intending to disguise herself as a man in order to attend the lectures of Dr. Beecham, and devised the name George Hazelton for her new identity. Chapter 11. Dr. Beecham outlines the course in the classroom, starting off by informing the students that they would be there for a few months in preparation for the Royal Physician's examination just before Christmas, so that they can practice medicine throughout the UK. He warns them that the course is going to be hard and dangerous, and there might be cuts, infections, or even diseases. He then brings in a live rabbit, kills it in front of the class, and tells anyone who thinks they cannot handle it to leave. Each then gets a dead rabbit to dissect, being asked to remove and identify its various organs. Soon afterwards Hazel completes the work and submits it to be the first student to have done so. Dr. Beecham is astonished. Whistled a boy named Thrupp critically called her a bootlicker, implying that she's only done it to try to suck up to him. Chapter 12. Over the weeks, Hazel is acing her class, on top of everybody else in it, with the harassments not stopping from Thrupp. Then, one day, Dr. Beecham informed them of a hanging that had just taken place and told them that they would have the chance the next day to do an autopsy on it. She was early for the autopsy and watched as the body had been laid on the table. Other students began to drift in, but there was no Dr. Beecham yet. Finally, Dr. Strain entered to perform the autopsy, and Hazel hoped he wouldn't recognize her. Chapter 13. Dr. Strain explains that Dr. Beecham does not really like to get his hands dirty and leaves most of the hands-on work when it comes to teaching to him. He calls Hazel forward and asks her to point out various organs, which she does poorly. Dr. Strain stresses the fact that though book learning is useful, the organs look pretty different from the illustrations. After class, Dr. Strain asks Hazel to stay after and makes it quite clear that he knows who she is. He says he has nothing against teaching a female but does object to teaching dilettantes who will never practice seriously. He tells her no one will hire her and that she should not come back. Heartbroken, Hazel goes home and cries. Chapter 14. The next morning, Hazel is so filled with frustration and sadness for her apparently futile struggles. In anger, she smashes a glass case in her room, tears out the pages of these and other books, and flings them over the balcony, sending them tumbling down into the ravine. Appalled by such destructive behavior on Hazel's part, Iona finally intervenes. Iona informs Hazel that Bernard is asking for her and insists on seeing her. Hurriedly, Hazel cleans up and goes down to meet him. Bernard asks her to join him for a walk, but Hazel replies that she is still indisposed. She then, in a most uncouth manner, sends him away, it seems, with hurt feelings, and he walks away. Then Iona informs Hazel that she should not have used such unjustified aggression against Bernard. As Iona and Charles clean the mess, Hazel suggests that they go outside and take a promenade while the weather is fine, and she cleans up. When she cleans up the room, she goes downstairs to eat something. Eating, she considers the impossibility of her position. She will have to end her studies soon, and she will be forced eventually to marry. She decides to know as much as possible in the time that remains, and immediately makes up her mind to go to another lecture in Edinburgh while she still can. Chapter 15. At Le Grand Lion, Mr. Arthur announces that the theatre is to close for the remainder of the season due to the Roman fever. Jack realizes that if he wants to have enough to eat, he'll have to steal another body soon. Chapter 16. Dressed in her own clothes, Hazel appears at the Anatomist Society and heads into the lounge, where she finds Dr. Beecham. She explains who she is and why she had posed as George Hazelton, asking him to let her continue to study. Dr. Beecham answers that, actually, the novelty of women in natural sciences is something that amuses him, but he would not want to go against Dr. Strain. He warns her that the classes will get harder. She then asks him if she could take the physician's exam without taking the course, promising that she'll find a way to pass. If she did, she argued, they should consider admitting women into their courses. Amused by her proposal, Dr. Beecham agrees to the wager and offers her an apprenticeship if she passed. He also gives her an updated version of her worn-out textbook. Chapter 17. As Hazel exits the Anatomist Society, she bumps into Jack, and they finally introduce themselves to one another. Hazel soon makes out that he is a grave robber and asks if he could procure a body for her. Meanwhile, she receives a letter from her mother that Percy has caught a cold. Chapter 18. Soon after, Jack shows up at the secret entrance to Hawthornden Castle and down into the cellar dungeon. He places a body onto the table in the center of the room and collects his payment from Hazel. As he starts to leave, she requests that Jack bring her the body of one who has died from the fever, telling him she would like to attempt finding a cure. Chapter 19. She has been doing so incessantly, with no rest, until Iona bursts into her room, reminding her that the Armont ball is tonight. Chapter 20. Hazel arrives at the Armonts a trifle late, yet without discourteous lateness, following a careful wash-up. Hazel dances with Bernard, who holds her a fraction too tightly. He also speaks of her recent absences at social functions and accuses her of perhaps seeing another suitor, mentioning the boots he saw in her entrance hall. Hazel reassures him that indeed the boots belonged to George and she had worn them because the garden was muddy. Bernard invites her on a walk on the grounds, and when they are private he attempts a brute kiss. They return to the party and Bernard, astonishingly, offers a proposal of marriage and announces it publicly. Hazel collapses, and someone sees her to the carriage waiting to take her home. Chapter 21. On the next morning, when Jack was supposed to deliver another body, Hazel waited with bated breath. But when Jack finally arrived, he had disappointing news. There was no body, and his partner, Munro, was missing after having gone on a dig a few nights ago. Jack says it is too dangerous to go without Munro because he has no lookout. Hazel says she will go along with him and be the lookout. Jack argues with her, but she digs in her heels. Finally, they agree to return to the castle at midnight. Chapter 22. She arrives in her disguise, and Jack finds her costume surprisingly convincing. They set off toward the cemetery behind St. Dwynwen, an hour's walk away. Hazel indicates they can ride, securing the wheelbarrow to her horse. She offers one to Jack, too, and it becomes obvious almost immediately that he doesn't know how to ride. Jack climbs on behind her, and Hazel finds the feeling intimate and strange. Once at the grave, they dug for almost an hour before Jack cracked the lid off the coffin and exposed the body inside. "Now help me undress him," he said. "Not that what we are doing is legitimate, but if we took any clothes or anything else from the grave it would be a felony." As the first rays of dawn were about to break through, they took their haste away to Hawthornden. Chapter 23. Days later, Jack turns up and asks her if she would teach him to ride. She agrees, teaching him some basics and then telling him to come again the next day for the second lesson. They go riding again, exploring around the edge of the property, walking along the stream. Jack showed her the wort flowers his mom had used inside the house for medicinal purposes. As they ride along, Jack tells Wells about a spate of unexplained disappearances among the poor in Old Town. As the Roman fever begins to spread, even less concern is shown for these missing individuals. On Sunday night, Hazel and Jack go off on another errand to fetch a body. Approaching the coffin, Hazel says that it's labeled with an R, for Roman fever, but when she looks at the corpse, she knows this can't be the case. The man apparently has been subjected to unnatural tortures, his eyelids sewn open. They suddenly hear footsteps and quickly hide in a hole in the ground. As the footsteps fade, Hazel finds herself leaning over and kissing Jack. They fall into his arms in sleep. At dawn, they are wakened by a priest who thought they were undead come back to life. They succeed in scaring him off and seize the opportunity to flee. Chapter 24. Hazel resumes her studies, but it is a while since this haunting image of a man's corpse was stitched open-eyed into her brain. Iona reaches the point where she thinks it will do Hazel good to be out in the open air when she is studying. Next, she proceeds to Prince's Street Gardens, teeming with life despite the illness, to sit in contemplation. While poring over the book given by Dr. Beecham, she notices a piece of vellum inside the book with the crude drawing of a human hand, and speculates how it may have come about. She is studying when Hyacinth Caldwater approaches her to congratulate her on her engagement. Only a short time thereafter, Bernard comes and finds her in the park, ruining her train of thought. Bernard apologizes for being so intense earlier, and for proposing to her in public. He asks Hazel once more if she'd marry him. She says yes, knowing this has been the answer she has always had in mind. Chapter 25. He has been staying at Le Grand Lion in order to manage things while it's closed. One morning, he's awakened by a knock at the front door. There is Jeanette. She has to see a doctor, she says, but she can't afford one. Since she doesn't know who else to turn to, Jack agrees to take her to Hazel. Jeanette insists that she is not pregnant because she has never been with a man and then recounts to say she hasn't had her period. She's had disturbing dreams of being in a room full of strangers and there being a one-eyed man holding a knife over her body. Immediately, Hazel begins to suspect that maybe this all relates to Dr. Strain. As Hazel examines Jeanette, she reveals an old scar from an appendix operation when she was young. Hazel notices that the old scar has somehow become infected and cleans the wound. She warns Jeanette, however, that this is probably not the reason for her missing period. Hazel informs Jack that if he knows anyone else in need of medical attention, she can help them and that there is space for them to stay if need be. In no time, her house becomes full with patients whom she tended to unwearyingly night and day, literally falling into bed every night from exhaustion. Before long, Isabella goes into labor and arrives in a rush. She explains that Thomas, the father of the baby, is now out of town with the military, the theater having closed down. Jack is taken aback by her appearance. Hazel leads Isabella onto a bench to deliver the baby and refers rather nervously to her textbook as guiding her through it. Fortunately, delivery goes well. Afterward, as Isabella lies down to rest, Jack gives her the fixed music box held together by paste. She names the baby Hazel. Chapter 26. The next morning, Jack wakes up to find that his infatuation for Isabella has vanished. He believes now he is instead smitten with Hazel. What she did for the needy ones encourages him a lot. Hazel shared her fears regarding what would happen if she messed things up. While talking, they share kisses once again, where Jack makes sure Hazel knows that she's beautiful. Chapter 27. The following week, Hazel witnesses the death of her first patient after one of her male patients dies of Roman fever. Through her hit-and-miss treatments with different remedies, she observes that wort flower treatment shows some promise. In a rejuvenated mood from such observation, Hazel writes to Dr. Beecham to inquire if anyone has developed any vaccine for the disease, telling him of her encouraging results using wort flower. Not long thereafter, there is a knock at her door. A one-armed boy introduces himself as Monroe and says he's looking for Jack. Chapter 28. Once they're all seated, Monroe explains to Jack that a few weeks ago he attempted to dig up a body himself. During this process, he encountered some men, one of whom he recognized from the night he and Davy were intercepted, the night described in the prologue. Monroe relates how one of the men used a substance to put him to sleep. He came back hours later, wheelchair-bound and with a black veil over his head. He was taken to a building marked with a gold plaque and then into a room that slightly looked like an auditorium of a theater. A doctor in the center was with a knife. After being put to sleep again, he woke up to realize that his arm was gone. She realizes that he must have been taken by the Ethereum and taken to the Royal Anatomist Society. Hazel looks at his missing arm and points out the wound in the arm is stitched up neat and professional. Monroe says he needs work since he can no longer dig. Hazel tells him that she has an opening for a groundskeeper on the grounds at the castle. She then sends for a constable, but the officer dismisses Monroe's story as a drunken fantasy and tells Hazel that she's a fool for believing him. Chapter 29. Hazel resumes her treatments of wort flower, which prove hopeful but not a full cure for her fevered patients. She continues sending notes to Dr. Beecham with no response. One day, a classmate of hers from anatomy class, Gilbert Burgess, comes in needing treatment for the Roman fever. Burgess is in utter shock when Hazel informs him she is the doctor and that she is, indeed, George Hazelton. After a few minutes of reunion, she tells Burgess of her deal with Dr. Beecham. Before long, Hazel is treating Burgess while Burgess is helping her study for her upcoming examination. When finally a letter comes back from Dr. Beecham, he is completely opposed to her treating herself with wort flour and scolds her that ungrounded folk remedies are a hazard. As Hazel reads the letter, she feels silly for having taken the trouble. Not long after that, another letter arrives from her mother, congratulating her on her engagement and informing her that Percy will be attending Eton the following year. Chapter 30. Meanwhile, Jack is haunted by the very thought of Hazel's engagement and her forthcoming wedding. Besides that, he is experiencing financial difficulties because the theatre remains shut. He had promised Hazel that he would never return to grave robbing because of the dangers involved. However, rejected by all the other employers, the alternatives seem bleak as Jack concludes that there are no other choices but to resort to that line once more. Chapter 31. Then one of the dinner guests at Armont House resurrects the old paradox of the ship of Theseus. When Hazel tries to join in, Bernard becomes exasperated and Lord Armont smoothly suggests that she might just listen to the men talk quietly. Baron Walford speaks about a surgical procedure that will replace his missing eye, but when Hazel asks him about it, he puts her off, suggesting she ought to spend her time making preparations for her wedding. Over dinner, Hazel tells Bernard that she hopes to be a physician, a concept not really sitting well with Bernard. She tells him that 1 week from now, she has a physician's test. He suggests they can only talk about it afterwards, but if she fails, she must never mention it again. Preassured of passing, she agrees quite readily. Chapter 32. On the test day, Hazel feels excited and nervous at once. The closer she gets to the building, the more she catches the sight of a man wheeled in with his face shrouded by a black veil. Instantly, Monroe's account of his lost arm flashes through her mind. She also remembers something from Baron Walford that today he was scheduled for surgery. Having time before her test, Hazel slips out a side door and hides herself under the rafters of the operating theatre. Chapter 33. Hazel sees a doctor along with Baron Walford and a blonde boy. The doctor gives Ethereum to the Baron, who agreed to it, then gives some to the fearful boy and he collapses. A tall man named Jones wheeled the boy in and helps the doctor with the procedure. Appalled, Hazel watches as the doctor removes Baron Walford's glass eye and replaces it with one of the boy's eyes. He then instructs Jones to tell anyone who inquires that the boy died of Roman fever if he should happen not to pull through. Hazel is horrified as the doctor introduces himself as Dr. Beecham, lowering his mask and peering directly at her to confirm that she is indeed there. Chapter 34. Jones takes Hazel from the cupboard she is standing in, faced with utter horror as events are happening right before her eyes. Dr. Beecham also manages to justify himself, telling her how important his work really is. Soon after, 2 other unconscious bodies are brought in. Hazel is taken aback when she realizes one of them is Jack. She starts begging for his release, while Dr. Beecham intends to use them for a heart transplant. Where Dr. Beecham made an incision on Jack, he starts to twitch a little. In a last, desperate act, Hazel reaches for her quill and stabs the man holding her. She screams for Jack to wake up. Miraculously, Jack comes to, notices a handkerchief full of Ethereum, and then uses that against Dr. Beecham. Together, the 2 injured exit the operating theatre into the street. Upon the sight of Bernard, Hazel asks him to take Jack to Armont House so she may look after his injury. Bernard agrees. At the house, Hazel spends her day taking care of Jack until Bernard comes home with dinner. She tries to tell him about her shocking discoveries pertaining to the Royal Anatomist Society and Dr. Beecham, begging him to tell the constable so that they can stop it. Bernard comforts her that he believes her but sends her home, but she fails to catch his anger. Chapter 35. Within 2 days, Jack was escorted to Hawthornden Castle and, within a week, he was fit enough to walk back to Le Grand Lyon. To his amazement, the theatre doors received a knock, and upon opening them stood a police constable, 2 guards, and with them the magistrate. So, they seize him and arrest him without warning for a number of murders, amongst them Penelope Harkis, Robert Paul, Mary McFadden, and Amelia Yarrow. They accuse him of killing these people to sell their bodies to the Royal Anatomist Society. Chapter 36. A week since the arrest of Jack, Hazel confronts Dr. Beecham in the Royal Anatomist Society. She asks him to take off his gloves to reveal mottled grey hands. Hazel confronts him with her theory that he really is the original Dr. Beecham who, somehow, has gained immortality. Dr. Beecham agrees yes, she is right. He is not the grandson of the original William Beecham, he is William Beecham. He tells her that he had tried to convince his wife, Eloise, to take the immortality tonic with him, but she refused. She reminds Dr. Beecham that Jack is innocent and will die on account of these accusations, but Dr. Beecham dismisses the possibility of aftermaths concerning Jack's fate. Instead, he offers Hazel the immortality tonic. He says she is the only person, apart from his wife, to whom he has made this offer because he thinks she could make good use of it. He then mentions that he will relocate to America to start anew. Chapter 37. By this time, Jack is convicted and sentenced to the gallows. Hazel has destroyed Bernard's letters and has called off the wedding. She isn't at all afraid of living without a title or money in her purse. Hazel bribes one of the guards to sneak her in to see Jack. She hands him a vial, assuring him this will save him from dying, even when he's being hanged. Hazel begs him to take it, but Jack says that would require him living on the run forever. He wants to live, he tells her, but is afraid by being with him their relationship would hold her back from doing the great work she's supposed to do while on the run. The following morning, Jack is hanged at the gallows. He then goes to the university teaching hospital, though there was nothing to indicate that it remained there. Chapter 38. A week after Jack's execution, Hazel loses her horse, Beetlejuice. During spring, Charles and Iona marry and head over to the village to reside, whereas Lady Sinnet and Percy remain in London. Meanwhile, Hazel continues treating patients on the first floor of the castle as a hospital. The remedy from wurtflower proves to work in keeping her Roman fever patients alive. Hazel surmises that Dr. Beecham must have known of its efficacy but discouraged her from its use because the Roman fever served as a convenient cover for the deaths he caused. She sometimes still thinks about Jack, what he's doing, or if he had simply relocated. Epilogue. In the epilogue, Hazel receives a letter postmarked from New York City. It contains the message, "My beating heart is still yours, and I'll be waiting for you," which leads her to believe that this is from Jack, and she should go to New York City if she ever wants to find him.